This is the Performance People podcast with me, Georgie.
And me, Ben. This pod is all about people who know about performance.
We're going to speak to some of the biggest performers in sport, entertainment, business and politics about how they got there and how they stay there.
And we'll talk to those closest to them about all the stuff we didn't already know about them.
You can listen to Performance People in the usual places where you get your podcast or watch us on YouTube. And don't forget, you can always follow us on our Performance People channels.
For now, though, here's our latest episode.
Joining us on today's Performance People are political and life partners who both played central roles in the New Labour movement.
Best known as Tony Blair's chief spin doctor, Alastair Campbell is a writer, strategist, and mental health campaigner who has battled depression himself through most of his adult life.
And joining Alastair is another political heavyweight, the educational campaigner and journalist Fiona Millar, who also happens to be Alastair's partner of 42 years.
It's a candid and wide-ranging conversation between two performance people who have operated right at the heart of Number 10.
I just started beating myself up physically. Quite badly, really landing blows on myself. I remember having that thought, you can't do this on your own anymore. Stop trying to do it on your own.
I always knew from the moment I met you that you'd be the sort of person who'd always be very, very interesting and challenging. But I didn't think I anticipated quite how challenging that could be.
What has life been like together as a couple? You've been through such tremendous things and such interesting, fascinating parts and moments in your lives. I mean, how, Fiona, perhaps you first. What is life like with Alastair? How has it been the past however many years that you two have been together? What does that look like from your perspective?
Well, I would say lots of ups and downs, and usually quite dramatic ones, to be perfectly honest. I mean, life's never boring with Alastair.
Is that it?
Well, I'm a person of few words. That's the truth, isn't it? You have profound highs and profound lows. And I always knew from the moment I met you that you'd be the sort of person who'd always be very, very interesting and challenging. But I didn't think I anticipated quite how challenging that could be.
I think you need to elaborate on that. You can't just say...
Because you're obviously very clever and you commanded the space around you, even when you were in your early 20s, and very ambitious. But I think for the first half of our life together, I thought he'd be a journalist, really. I didn't think we'd get into that whole... The political thing was a bit of a sort of left field, massive, dramatic life change for us. And, going into Number 10, the election in 97, and then coming out the other end of that. So that took me in a direction I never thought our life would go in, yeah. And also presented a lot of ups and downs, didn't it?
Yeah. But you met down in the West Country, if that's right, working in local publications, press down, Tavistock Times, is that right? And
yeah, do you know that area?
I grew up in Cornwall, so I know it reasonably well.
Yeah, we were in Cornwall for a year. We were in Truro and Falmouth for a year. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I grew up on Restronget Creek, just off the Foul Estuary. So yeah, it's a beautiful part of the world. But I guess what I wanted to ask is, back then working in the West Country, did you ever dream that you would end up, being part of Number 10 and the government and, just having such a huge impact on Britain and I guess throughout the world? I mean, did you talk about those dreams or ambitions, or it just sort of just happened?
Well, when Fiona and I met as trainee journalists, and so we spent the first few months in a porter cabin learning shorthand, and then we went to the Tavistock Times, and then we went to the Sunday Independent in Truro. But we were part of the Mirror training scheme, so we always assumed that would be 2 years down in the West Country and then get to London and Fleet Street. I think if I look back to that period, I think we both probably thought we'd end up as pretty serious, high-flying journalists. I probably thought, in my heart of hearts, the ultimate ambition for me would be to be editor of the Daily Mirror. Fun enough, before I made the jump into politics, I can remember Neil Kinnock, of all people, who's a very good friend of ours, but I can remember him telling me I should prepare myself to be the next Michael Parkinson. That's what he thought I should go on to be. So I think I felt I was on the way to a media career, but Fiona's from a very political family in a way that I'm not. And I felt myself becoming more and more political through my journalism, and then actually became a political journalist. And then I think when Fiona's talking about the ups and downs, I had a very big down in the 80s when I had a psychotic breakdown. And bizarrely, there was a lot of politics involved in that. And I think that was the next impulse. I mean, I won't tell you the story, it's too complicated, but there was, I mean, just to give you a snapshot of how political it was, if you said the word right in any context when I was in this psychotic state, I thought you were trying to make me right wing.
And red and blue.
And red and blue, anything to do with red and blue, I was cracking. It was really literally making me crack up. So there was a lot of politics, and I think eventually I just decided that politics was where I wanted to be. But I thought even then I thought it would be political journalism. And it was when John Smith died in 1994 and Tony Blair asked me to work for him. That was when the change came. And as you gathered from Fiona's earlier reply, against her will, I made a very big change in our lives.
Alastair, I mean, when Tony Blair asked you to come and work with him, were you worried about your mental health? How much did it concern you that you'd had this episode and whether that would rear its head again under such pressure?
Oh, a lot. And I raised it with him. I actually said no for the first month, really. But I regret, when you say no to something and you think, I'm actually doing this for the wrong reasons, I'm doing it because people are telling me to do that. But deep down, I felt I had to do it. But no, I definitely was worried. And I can remember having this conversation with him when I decided to say yes. And I told him all the things I felt he needed to know about me, including, he knew about the breakdown, but he never knew how bad it had been. So I told him about, and I can remember we were in this car coming back from Marseille airport, and I was driving and looking at him in the mirror. And I was telling him about when there was this period of the breakdown where I had bagpipes in this part of the head and Elvis Presley singing over here and a row with Fiona going on in here and a classical orchestra going on here, just utter cacophony of chaos and noise and disturbance. And I can remember Tony doing one of his little, Roy's our son's name, sorry about that. That was very Freudian, wasn't it? And Tony did this little sort of, what I call his Bambi look, where he just sort of started to look a bit panicked. But then he said, well, look, I'm not worried about any of that, so what's the problem?
Were you one of the people saying to Alastair, please don't take it?
Yeah, because my dad had just died and I just literally had a baby like 8 weeks before. So I was quite grieving and also had this tiny baby, and I probably wasn't in a very good psychological state myself, which is quite unusual for me. And it just, I just knew it would be, full of adrenaline and excitement and stimulating. I also knew it would be a lot of stress and pressure in our lives. I just knew that. And it, so I was partly right about both things. It was exciting and innovating, but it was also quite stressful. Yeah.
And how did the pressure of that job... Yeah, exactly. How did the pressure of that job, Alastair, sort of manifest itself on a daily basis with somebody who's constantly sort of aware that there's this other thing in the background that might rise up again at any given time?
I think back in the day when I had the first breakdown, I think that drink had played a large, I think I covered up a lot of my other stuff with drink. And I think what I did after that, when I stopped drinking, was to cover it up with work. And so the workaholism, which people who I was working with kind of liked and respected, although to be fair to Tony Blair, he sometimes worried I overdid it. But I think that was the way that I dealt with it. So even though it's only when I went back through, when I published my diaries and I went back through them, it's only then that I really realised that it was obvious I'd had quite a lot of quite bad depressive phases, but I just kind of powered my way through them in the main. And the thing about when you're doing something as all-consuming as we were doing, you kind of do have the capacity to do that. But and even though it makes you feel terrible and exhausted when you're not doing it, I don't know. I know lots of people can't do this and they collapse, but most of the time I was able to keep going.
But I think the thing to remember is that Alastair was never diagnosed with anything until 2005, which was 2 years after he'd left Number 10. So as time went on, it seemed like the breakdown was a sort of one-off incident. Didn't really feel like he was mentally ill. But looking back now, he's obviously suffered from depression all of his life. And the breakdown was a culmination of a very bad sort of depressive period that was covered up with a lot of alcohol.
You're in his life all of the time. So did you see that?
Not really, no, because what I know now about mental health, I now realise that there were so many signs there that we ignored, because people we're talking about the sort of 90s into the noughties. People didn't talk about mental health in the way they do now. And I think there was if people were high functioning, I suppose, and holding down very successful jobs, nobody would have thought they could possibly be mentally ill at the same time. Now it's become much more common for famous people and successful people to talk about their mental health and ill health. That wasn't the case then. And because Alastair refused to have any psychiatric assistance or help after he left the hospital where he had his nervous breakdown in Scotland, life just went back to normal. There was no diagnosis, there was no medication, there were no regular psychiatric appointments, there was nothing. It was like the job became the new alcohol, really, in a way, in the form of self-medication. But I see all this now, but it wasn't the case at the time that we realised that he was actually probably unwell for some of it.
And I guess back in those days, it was seen as a weakness, whereas now it isn't, thankfully, or not as much. I don't think, maybe correct me if I'm wrong in thinking that, but it seems like there's so much more understanding for it and support now.
Yeah, although I have to say, I never felt that stigma. When I came back from hospital and I had to take a bit of time off at home, and I went to stay with some friends down in the West Country, and then when I finally went back to work, I found people were actually really supportive. I mean, the Mirror, where I went back to, was a very hard drinking culture, but nobody tried to get me off the wagon. I didn't feel I had to hide it from anybody. I felt actually it was quite a good place. And one of the things I tried to do in my mental health campaigning is try to encourage people to be open, because I think they'd be surprised that you're going to get some people who'll, try to exploit it against you. But in the main, I think people are much, much more understanding. So I've heard a lot of people who talk about the effect the stigma has had on them, but me personally, I've never felt it. I think it helped as well. I had a brother who had schizophrenia, so we'd maybe knew more about mental illness than a lot of families did, and he was able to live not a bad life given it's such a horrible condition. And I think that helped make me feel more comfortable about my own condition, which was never as bad as what he had.
But the truth is, you didn't manifest as somebody who's mentally ill. You went back to being a very successful person. So you don't know if you'd had long periods off, depressed, or been on medication, you might have felt differently. But it was never acknowledged until finally this other sort of different type of breakdown in 2005, after which it was agreed by Alastair and some of our closest friends and I that he needed to get some professional help. And that's when he was properly diagnosed.
Yeah. So was there something of an intervention then
that you've
at
been
that
campaigning
point?
about? Yeah.
Yeah, it was, I guess. I don't know if an intervention is the right word. It was an intervention that I finally realised I had to make myself. We had this. I can't remember what was going on in our lives, but I'd been very depressed for quite a long time. And I guess I was what you call self-harming. Fiona and I were out walking on the heath, and I just started beating myself up physically. Quite badly, really landing blows on myself. And as I was doing it, I could tell that Fiona was scared. I was scared. And I can remember thinking, I've got to sort this out. I can't do this on my own. I remember having that thought, you can't do this on your own anymore. Stop trying to do it on your own. And we phoned this Philip Gould, one of my closest friends. He knew a psychiatrist that he'd been arguing I should try and see for some time, and I went to see him. And from that day on, I started seeing him regularly for quite a few years. And I still get depression. I was in not a very good state just a few days ago, but it's a lot better than it's been for a long, long, long time.
So how do you manage it when it happens? And Fiona, how do you manage it as well? Because it's not just about the person that's got it, is it? It's the person that's having to be party to that.
I think the first thing I say that I never used to be open about it. I probably did play mind games in relation to it, and if Fiona wanted to take the blame for why it was happening, I was kind of happy with that. I used to think, well, if I'm feeling absolutely shit, I don't see why everybody else shouldn't. And, I think that's something I've learned to try very hard not to do. And the way I've tried to do that is to just be very, very open now. I'm very open. As soon as I start to feel myself on a depressive slide, the first thing I do is tell Fiona. If the kids are here, I'll tell them. If I really feel like I'm struggling, I'll phone David, this guy that I see. And then I do, I have lots of different tactics. I do take medication still every day. I try and work all the time. Even if I don't feel like it, I exercise every day. And, it's things like I might not feel like, going out for 4 hours on the bike, but I'll try and do half an hour on the bike. Or I might feel like not going out on the house, but when the house is empty, I'll walk up and down the stairs for half an hour. I'll just do something. And then I have things like music. I find music incredibly important when I'm not feeling great. I don't read papers. I read books and I listen to music rather than that. And then, I try to retreat into things that I know have helped me through before. But I think the openness is the most important thing. I really do. I think that has been the key for both of us, really.
Yeah, I think, well, it was only when Alastair wrote this book about depression, and they asked me to write the last chapter about what it was like living with somebody who had depression. And as I wrote it, I mean, thinking in ink is always very good. And as I wrote it, I could feel myself analysing my own feelings and realising that for most of our life together, I blamed myself for however he was. And he, as he says, people who are mentally ill can be quite manipulative. He was quite happy to make me feel guilty. So once I'd realised that I was wrong, it wasn't. I may have been doing things that exacerbated the situation, but fundamentally, it wasn't my fault. It became a lot easier. And actually, then I started this small sort of support group with people who contacted me after they read the book, and we meet every couple of weeks to talk online. They've all got depressive partners. It's so interesting, some of the common characteristics that have come out from these various different people. And guilt and blame is a big, big part of it. It's very, very common for people who live with somebody who's mentally ill to feel that it's their fault, because they're usually the cat that gets kicked. And you think, if this person I live with and I love very much is very unhappy, it must be something that I'm doing that's wrong. And actually, by and large, that isn't the case. It's something else that's going on, and you need to try and understand that. It's like being a detective. You need to try and understand what's going on in their head, and it's really very difficult to understand, if you haven't suffered from depression, what it is like for somebody who does have it.
And what about the kids and protecting them from this, or in fact not, or being really open about it with them, and then how it affects their lives? How have you sort of managed that over the years? Because we've got 2 young children, but I can imagine that as they get older, it's difficult to keep things that are, this serious to sort of talk about and walk through and everything else with them from them. And should you actually just be very open about it all?
Well,
I think the important thing is, as I say, it wasn't diagnosed in their early lives. They probably knew that their dad was quite difficult, and the way he led his life was quite challenging in some ways, as well as being wonderful fun and a great father. And he was wonderful fun and a great father, but they didn't know until they were quite old that he was a depressive.
But when I started seeing the psychiatrist, I actually sat them down one by one. So that would have been 2005. So Rory was, in his teens?
18 or something, yeah.
Yeah, and Grace was the only one who was still technically, I guess, a child. But I remember sitting down with each of them and just saying, I'm going to see this guy. I've spent my whole life trying to wrestle with this stuff. I've tried to do it on my own. I've realised I need help, and I'm going to see him, but don't worry about it. And actually, I think one of the most important things that David, the psychiatrist, did at a certain point, he said he wanted to meet Fiona, which he did. And that we had some pretty harsh sessions together. And then he wanted to see the kids as well. And I think the main reason from their perspective that he wanted to do that was to emphasise this point that they should never think it's their fault. And in fact, that they are, the kids in particular, a while back. Now I'd say it's Fiona that's the biggest kind of, the person who can pull me out of it best. But it used to be the children. But I felt bad about that because I felt I was using them. I only felt comfortable in their company when I was in a depressive state, because whether it was because I was forcing myself to be a bit different, I don't know. But and Grace, our daughter, she's very, very in my face about it in a good way. She's like, what can I do? And if it's nothing, at least tell me it's nothing. But I want to know, and why is it happening? And she's not aggressive, but she's kind of there in my face. Whereas the boys are just a little bit more, leave me to it. They know I've been through it before and that I'll get through it again.
I remember you spoke about, I think you were in Scotland, and you were talking about someone in the crowd asked you a question that you found really difficult to deal with, because it was about asking you when you were, I think it was you going back to politics or putting into action some of the things that you were talking about, and that weight of expectation bearing down. Is that the sort of thing that triggers it? Is that the sort of thing that makes you think, oh, I've got this insurmountable amount of stuff to deal with. How am I ever going to get there or get through any of it or work it through in my mind?
Well, that was a really interesting one, because most of my depressions, they come on slowly and I can sort of feel them coming on. But that literally was an instant thing, wasn't it?
No, I don't think. I think you were getting quite sort of
agitated
on the way up to Scotland that weekend.
But it was definitely a tipping point. And the guy, it was at a book festival, and the guy asked this question. He mentioned the podcast. He said, I listened to your podcast with Roy Stewart. I think it's great what you're trying to do, bring people together from different tribes, etc., but you've got to take it further. You have a responsibility and a duty to start a new party and to sort this whole mess that we're in out. And I just, as he said it, I could feel myself collapsing inside, because I thought, well, I can't do it. I don't feel I've got it in me to do that on my own. And so, yeah, and funny enough, one of the things that I talk a lot about with David, the psychiatrist, he defines my central problem as a never-ending conflict between self and service, between wanting a nice life, looking after myself, really doing things that I want to do, but at the same time, kind of feeling an exaggerated sense of responsibility about the state of the world. And I sometimes, when I'm in a bad way, when the depression and the anxiety are both kicking in, I can literally lie in bed and I can develop a mental process where I become, at the end of it, single-handedly to blame for climate crisis. I could just, and I know it's irrational, but when you're feeling like that, it's a horrible feeling. So that definitely triggered something in me, and I wasn't very good for a while afterwards.
No, well, we don't want to drive you back into deepest, darkest depression, but we did want to touch on a couple of those key issues. Because as I said earlier, I'm a massive fan of the podcast, yours and Rory's. I think it's brilliant. I love it. But that point you made, that question that you had about, this polarization in politics and how, what's the way forward? It seems like it's incredibly hard to answer that question about why can't you, for example, start a third party, a new party that actually finds a middle ground there that, I think most people perhaps would say, with a bit of common sense, would say it needs this, this far right in the Tory party, far left in the Labour Party isn't working. It's not going to be the pathway forwards. What is the answer to that?
I mean,
change of electoral system.
Yeah,
how long have we got?
The answer.
We've got about an hour.
Got another half an hour.
Can't do it with our first past the post, can you?
Yeah. But the answer, people often say, look, Macron did it in France, okay. But Macron did it in France because they have a presidential system, and he realised that if he went for it and became president, he could break the mould from that perspective, and he did it. And it's amazing what he achieved. But our system, it's a parliamentary democracy. We vote for candidates from parties, and then the party that can form a majority, that is where the Prime Minister comes from. It's a totally different system. And I guess my worry, as speaking as a kind of tribally, historically Labour person, is that even though I've thought a lot about whether, I agree with your basic analysis, the Tory party has just become this horrible right-wing rump, but they've got a very strong base. The Labour Party, particularly under Corbyn, went way far too to the left. The Liberal Democrats have kind of vanished because, Clegg's, what happened when they were in government, they just lost that kind of sense of who they are, and so they've been in trouble. Scotland, meanwhile, is being completely dominated by the SNP. I just worry that if we did kind of create some sort of new party, the net beneficiary in our system is going to be the Tory party again. So the system, we have to believe enough, all of us, in the long term, and understanding that unless we vote for parties that genuinely want to change the system, we're going to get this again and again and again and again. That's right, isn't it? Mm.
How does anybody get anything done? When you look at the recent change of leaderships, you look at the proclamation of the King, and there's sort of 6 prime ministers stood in front of him there, former prime ministers. And you think, how do we ever get anything done? There's this ever-changing sort of circus of whatever it may be. But it just feels like there's not enough time to get things done properly. And we talk about climate change and people who obviously campaign for that, wanting to make, a decent impact. But how does actually anything get done in a situation where you're constantly changing these governments and people aren't sticking at jobs for longer than 5 minutes?
Well, funny enough, one of the questions on the podcast today was from somebody, I don't know if you know this, but a guy who said that there had been 9 secretaries of state for education in the last 12 years.
Exactly.
Now, there's no way you can deliver an effective education policy if you're lasting there an average of a year and a bit.
2 years, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's hopeless. So, I mean, the only thing is you say things can't get done, but things will get done. I mean, Brexit was done, and it was done in part because, and Ben, thank you for all the support during the various campaigns. But the fact is it was done. I know it didn't, but, there we go. We lost. They're about to bring back, get rid of the cap on bankers' bonuses. That's doing something. It can be I would think is the wrong thing. They're going to do loads of stuff. The question is it the right stuff for the country? And if the country thinks it's not, how does the country get a change? Now, in our system, the only change currently can be the Labour Party. But if the Labour Party isn't connecting with people in the way that it needs to, then we're just going to carry on with this kind of, as Ben says, a bit of a quagmire, and you'll get change and you'll get churn. I've got enough confidence that I'm actually writing a book at the moment called But What Can I Do? And it's trying to help people kind of make sense of this. And the answer basically is we all have to do what we think we can do. But I think the change will come because I think where we are now is utterly untenable. And funny enough, I think having gone through that extraordinary period between the death and the funeral of the Queen, where you had a sense of the country actually being quite good at doing something, and that, particularly the funeral itself and that day. And I think very quickly we're going to get into a sense of, well, if we can do that, why can't we do this? And why can't we do that? And why can't we run the health service properly? Why are the schools not properly funded? I think it will switch. And look, if it doesn't, we're absolutely knackered and we might as well all go home. But I think it will switch. I really do.
I really hope you're right.
The other thing is you could end up with seeing the breakup of the United Kingdom. I mean, that is possible. And that, I think that might force some very radical thinking if you end up just being England on its own.
Yeah.
I think the possibility of a border poll in Ireland and the North, it'll be very messy, it'll be very difficult, it'll be very fraught, but I can see that happening before Scotland going independent. You mentioned before, Ben, the podcast chat we had with Mark Drakeford, and I thought he was very interesting on if Scotland did go independent, that would really have an impact upon thinking in Wales. So that is a possibility, and it's a real one. And I think we're kidding ourselves if the fact that there was this extraordinary kind of outpouring of support for the Queen, that somehow means that the country, the United Kingdom, is coming back together again. I'm not sure that's true.
On the subject then of King Charles III, what is the task for him moving forward? I mean, he has to be apolitical now, which he hasn't been in the past, and we've known a lot about his thoughts prior to this. What if you were advising him? What would your advice be to him in the sort of days and months and weeks that follow?
I did an interview with Prince William a few years ago for GQ magazine, and I asked him. George was just a little child at the time, so I said, look, there's only really 3 people in the country who can sort of genuinely sit around and say to themselves, I either am, in the case of the Queen, or I might be one day quite soon, the monarch. Okay, there's only 3 of you. I said, do you ever sit around, just the 3 of you, chatting about the job and what it entails and how differently you might do it? And William said, no, we've never, ever done that, which I was genuinely surprised by. He then said, the truth is you have to work it out for yourself. You have to work out how you're going to do it. And what that says to me is I don't think Charles necessarily will become that different. There's a difference between being political and being engaged in political events and debate. And I hope he does carry on saying things that, what the Queen was very good at is never being defined as party political. And I don't think Charles, I remember there was once when we felt Charles was getting a bit too close, we felt defending the so-called forces of conservatism. But I think he's actually been quite radical on some issues. And I think it'd be a shame if he just sort of forgot that. My advice would be to show, not tell. And they're very good at that. They're very good at that. I think show, not tell is the way. Don't have raging headlines saying Charles rants at Liz Truss lifting the ban on fracking. But, out and about on visits, you can communicate an awful lot.
Yeah, there was a great article about the Queen's clothes and how she used what she was wearing to... So, like, when Trump came, she wore this brooch that had been given to her by the Obamas. And then, when she went to Ireland, she had a big shamrock on her collar with that. She didn't have to say anything, but... I think there's other
and she
ways
loved
of
wearing
it.
those bright colours, didn't she? Because she wanted always to be able to be picked out in a crowd, however garish the colours were. You could always pick her out in a crowd. Did you ever have that, Fiona, with Sherry Blair? Because you four were the original Fab Four, I guess, way back when.
Well, I think
the Beatles might argue about that.
I do think it's always very important to remember if you're in number 10 that you aren't the head of state. I mean, the thing is, there's a lot of the public get very muddled up and think that the sort of the Prime Minister's wife is the First Lady. But, that isn't the case. And you also find out very quickly if you do something wrong there that you're not the head of state, because I think the monarchy are forgiven a lot of things that Prime Ministers aren't. So I think it's a slightly different role, but it's certainly true that I felt with her, there was a lot she could do without actually giving interviews or making things explicit, just by her actions and the causes that she took up and the way she demonstrated that she supported. And I think the new Princess of Wales does that extremely well. She's chosen specifically a few very specific causes sort of close to her heart, and she's made herself a bit of an expert in them. She doesn't give many speeches or write articles, but everybody knows what she thinks about those things and what she supports. And I do think, whatever you may feel about the monarchy, it does have an influence on the way the public think about those issues. So early childhood, which is one of her things, which I'm very interested in too. I think she'll do a lot of good in that area, even though she's not professionally trained in it. It can make a big difference. Yeah.
Well, I think, on the mental health campaigning front, William and Harry and Kate have been brilliant.
Yeah.
They really have their heads together campaign. I think I'm actually quite sad at the seeming rift and Harry going off, because I think they were an amazing team in terms of how they campaigned on that. And if and when William becomes king, I'd be really upset if he decided, I won't be campaigning anymore.
He's done a lot with young men and sport and mental health, hasn't he? And that's been impressive,
Yeah.
So what about Meghan and Harry? I mean, everyone watches this with, crikey. I mean, most of us are sort of in disbelief at the next thing that sort of occurs in the media. I mean, Alastair, more than anybody, that relationship with the media. I mean, what do you think is really going on there? What is happening here? Is it just that, they want to go away and do their own thing? It feels very much like it's very much in public view. It's not as private as they suggested it might be.
The honest answer is I don't know. And I think one of the reasons that the Queen... My favourite line about the Queen was Tina Brown wrote this wonderful piece in the New York Times, and she said, "We're so going to miss not knowing what she thinks." And I thought that was absolutely brilliant. So we actually don't know a lot of this stuff. And so these conventional wisdoms form... And so, on the one hand, you can read and hear people saying that Meghan's an absolute sort of out for the main chance, all about herself, and she's wrecked, she's got Harry under her thumb, and you can hear all that. On the other hand, and this is kind of, I think, where I am, I look at both William and Harry, and I think there are two blokes who were born into the public eye, who deep in their hearts believe that their mother, whom they loved, was killed, in part because of this insatiable desire of the media to know about her and to follow her and so forth. They believe that. And I think there's a part of Harry that does see that same kind of dynamic going on with Meghan. I think there is an element of racism attached to it. I think there is definitely an element of misogyny attached to it. And then there's also the stuff going on that we don't know about, which is I don't know what the genuine story is between what's happened between him and William. And so...
But surely, I mean, the thing is, if you were advising them, I'm sure you would say, look, you've got to decide what you want to do. Do you want to be a royal? If you don't want to be a royal, stop kind of pretending to be a royal and stop giving in to stop talking about them all the time. I mean, I think they need to kind of shut that side of it down and get on with whatever good works they can do, but not kind of looks to me like they kind of don't want to be royal, but they want to cash in on their royal status by earning money out of it. And I think that's not a great look for them. I think a lot of people do see it like that. I mean, it's, and you know, that because then you get accused of all these other things, like you said, of being racist or misogynistic. But I mean, the bottom line is, you can't sort of stand there and wipe a tear away and then give an interview the next day saying, "Oh, they made my life a misery." My life a misery. It just looks bad.
Yeah, but Harry was, that was his grandmother who was being, laid to rest.
I'm talking about her, not him.
No, I know, but she's his wife.
Yeah. But I mean, I think, and also I think there's an element of they're very privileged, and it sort of feels a bit uneasy to me to have people who've got so much wealth and, privilege and power to be moaning constantly about how awful their lives are, when there are people whose lives are really bloody awful, and they're the ones we should be worrying about, really.
I like what your mum said, Fiona, when she said there's no such thing as women's lib. There's just women doing two jobs.
Just do two jobs.
but it is a perpetual
that was
juggle.
before I even had kids or anything.
But have you ever found a solution? Because I'm still as I suspect most women that also work are just constantly struggling to find that making that juggle work. I don't know what the answer is.
You've got to get them to do more.
Really,
You've got to
though,
get them
how?
to do more. Men have to share the the parental leave, start from a very early stage, doing the things that become the woman's responsibility by default. And then once you've got into that groove, it's very hard to get out of it again.
And I noticed that Ben just did two of the most defensive body language tricks. He tapped his nose and then he scratched the back of his neck.
I don't know what you mean.
Alistair, what do you do?
I'm folding my arms.
I can
But
change nappies as well as the rest of them. What are you talking about?
Yeah, everybody changes a nappy. Everybody changes a nappy, but it's all the other stuff that goes into the sort of domestic democracy, I call it. Are you really sharing all the responsibilities? And I think one of the problems with the way parental leave is geared at the moment, and I went, I went back to work very quickly after our first child was born because that was the law then, and then I gave the job up after about 9 months and started working from home. And from that point on, it was that I was on the mummy track, which was going that way, and Alastair was going that way, and it was quite hard for the two to meet. There's a guy who gave a wonderful lecture once called the Alarednik syndrome, which is Cinderella in reverse. So you start off as the princess and you become Cinderella, and that's what happens. And then you're the one that does the washing,
very frustrating.
the ironing, the bin bags, the shopping. It's not the nice fun stuff with the kids; it's all the other stuff.
Do you know what I also
freely
think it is?
Confess, I am terrible. I am terrible, I confess.
But it's also the thinking time, like having to think through. So this weekend, sort of catering for a bunch of people, it's like, who's going to think through what we need? Then who's going to go and get it? Then who's going to make it? Then who's going to clear it up? Then who's going to do this and that and the other? And it sort of ends up becoming a default setting, which is even more frustrating. And I don't know why I go along with that, but I do. What are you shaking your head for?
Because you love him.
No, I just patching.
But I feel now.
So, who's going to think about all this stuff? Well, we could share that.
Ben puts the bins out and then he wants a medal for it. That's the problem.
Outrageous.
Ben, you're letting the side down. Don't put the bins out.
It's called habits. I just think you get into sort of habits, don't you?
I know. We need to learn how to change it
I'm going
up.
to defend myself a little bit here. You're making it sound a lot way worse than it actually is.
Yeah, but also listen, George. Let me just tell you something. You are sitting next to somebody who has achieved things that no other human being has done. That's special.
You're not helping, Alistair.
That's special.
Alistair, thanks.
And Fiona, likewise, is sitting next to... Oops, sorry.
Did you know who's a pin-up idol that millions of women want to be with? I get told it every day how lucky I am.
Oh, my goodness.
But I think, seriously, we've got to a certain point in our lives when I kind of feel I'd quite like to retire. Not retire, I won't stop doing anything, but just sort of take it easier, and I keep saying to us, you don't know what it's like to have done 2 jobs for the past 30 years. You've only had to do your one thing. You've done it very well, but it is exhausting having that parallel train of thought always having to go on in your head, isn't it?
Yeah, but
Well, especially if you're
sailing's hard,
Alastair and you're constantly strategizing about how to save the planet, which he is, obviously.
I know, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There'd
You
be
have
no
that
room for the
massive
bins in that,
restlessness,
that's for
don't
sure.
you? It's a real restlessness. You have that restlessness. I mean, you can never go on holiday with you. It's an absolute
hate going on
nightmare.
holiday.
I mean, it's
Hate
not
it.
an enjoyable experience to go on holiday with Ben. It isn't. It's not. It's no
Alistair's
fun
worst
for
depressions.
anyone.
Alistair's worst depressions always happen on holiday, and I think that's why, because the sort of the
Yep.
the scaffolding that keeps him going, which is all his stuff and busyness, all disappears. And then there's nothing else left, and it's scary for him.
Yeah.
Is that how you see it, Alastair? You need the structure.
I don't know if I need structure. I need to be doing stuff, and it's true that I only saw this pattern when I was going through the diaries. It was just amazing how often 4 or 5 days into a holiday I would have an absolute crash. And I think again it's this clash of expectations. You've built yourself up in your mind, right? I've got to spend time with Fiona and the kids. I've got to be in a different mode. And I get there, and the pressure of work or the pressures I put on myself means that I don't go into a different mode. And then the clash between the expectation of what you're meant to be and what and who you actually are then riddles you with guilt and angst and all that stuff. And before you know it, I've crashed. And yeah, I can, one of the worst ever was when, and to this day, I can't really know what was going on, but on holiday in this house in France, and I'd gone and thought I'd locked myself in the bathroom because I just couldn't stop crying. And one of our sons came in and said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "I haven't got a clue." And
Holidays are terrible things, aren't they?
I'm with Ben. Just keep working.
It's funny though, isn't it? Because but an athlete is not just Fiona's going to hate me for this. An athlete is not dissimilar to what Alastair is describing. There is always most athletes have this crash after retiring from whatever sport they may do because of that routine. They're so used to having that routine built in, isn't it? And what they do in their day. You suddenly take that away, and it's like, who are you? You don't know who you are anymore. I mean, your routine has been built into you from such an early age, hasn't it? As an athlete, that it could all just fall over when that comes to an end. Isn't that fair?
Yeah, I think so. But I think Alastair said, you want to be doing something, sitting on a beach.
You're lucky with
feeling
sailing.
like
You can just keep sailing
you're not
forever.
achieving anything. It's terrible.
Just keep sending him out to sail. Sport's great for therapy, isn't it, Alastair? Isn't that a great way to relax for you? Do you find that's sort of a way to sort of get away from all of it?
Supporting Burnley, I wouldn't have
Well,
thought.
yes, of course it is. They have ups and downs like anyone else.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
For sport doing it, I do something sporting every day. I'm about at 4:15. I'm seeing my boxing guy. He's coming round to hit a few pads. But Burnley,
Prescott.
I think. No, John. I don't quite have the sharpness of the jab that John has, but I think that. No, Burnley's much more to me than a football team. It's something quite deep. My sister, who's a Christian, she basically thinks that Burnley is to me what God is to her, which is not. It's not quite the same, but it sometimes feels like that. But I do. It's funny though. Recent years, I've become less obsessed with sport.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe since the boys have moved out, I find myself watching less sport now than I used to. But I still think that, that is where I have had some of the great highs and lows in my life have been through following a football club. I love it.
And physically, actually, like you say, you're doing your boxing later. That really helps, doesn't it? With the endorphins and everything else. If you can do that, a few times a week, that does help put you in the right place, doesn't it? In the right headspace.
I think so. And I think also I just like feeling fit. I like, I'm coming from a family of 4 kids. Both my brothers died age 62. And, I'm now 65. And Donald, he had schizophrenia and the medication was a problem, etc. But I had another brother he just never took care of himself. He never looked after himself physically. And, I think it's important that we, particularly with a government that I don't think is committed to a proper running of the health service and doesn't understand mental health, I'm afraid there's an awful lot that we have to do for ourselves. And keeping physically fit is definitely part of that. And that's again where, Fiona has been an amazing help because she's, we eat well. I've stopped drinking again. So, I think looking after yourself physically is just It's fundamental to mental health.
Yeah. Fiona, what do you do? I mean, I'm not sure if you share this passion for Burnley
Well,
or
I've
not.
always been a swimmer.
What do you do? Swimming. Great.
Yeah, I've always been a swimmer. That's my main addiction. And now cold water swimming. I've done normal temperature swimming for about 40 years, so now I've decided to present myself with a new challenge and do it in very cold water through the winter.
You are
we're
a
both
braver
cold
woman
water
than I.
junkies.
Yeah, but it is. I mean, it's good. You need a new challenge later in life, and I've really enjoyed that one. Yeah. So, yeah.
It's a good time actually to ask you, because we're about to draw it to a close. Good time to ask you performance tip. So if an everyday person like myself is saying to you guys, what can I do to perform better every day? What would it be? What would your little nugget be to tell me what to do every day, which would mean I'd perform better in life? I mean, Fiona, why didn't you go first?
Well, I honestly think the cold swimming is quite an amazing psychological boost to start the day with. I do, and I speak as somebody who's swum in normal indoor pools for most of my life, but it does certainly sharpen up the start of the day, and then I do a lot of yoga as well. And I've only started that last year, and I really got into that in the lockdown when they shut down the swimming pools. And I found now most days I can't function unless I do at least 20 minutes of yoga every day for some reason. So those two things for me are the kind of, I'm a vegetarian as well. I don't drink very much, but those two things for me are at the moment my sort of touchstones for keeping well.
What I would do, George, is I would ask you to come around here and look at the wall behind my laptop, where you will see some great words of wisdom from lots of different people. Funny enough, one of them Fiona has already quoted, which is Think in Ink, Marilyn Monroe. I bet you didn't know Marilyn Monroe said that. Everything is impossible till you make it happen, Nelson Mandela. You can have that one. If there's nobody in your way, you're not going anywhere, Bobby Kennedy.
What about the...
By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail, Benjamin Franklin.
What's the one about being...
Let the racket do the talking, John McEnroe. You can have that one.
It's amazing what you... Yeah, but that doesn't apply to me. It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit.
I like that.
What about this one? Ted Lasso. It's never the wrong time to do the right thing.
I love Ted Lasso. Love it. Guilty pleasure.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys.
He's up there on my wall of fame. Oh, you like this one, Ben? Ben will like this one. Ben will like this one. Waiting for your opponent to fail is never a strategy. Garry Kasparov.
That's good.
Could be waiting a long time.
We need a bigger boat. We need a bigger boat.
Right. Lovely.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. Thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's wonderful to talk
Not
to you.
at all. It's lovely to see you both.
Take care. Bye. Bye.
We'll see you soon. Lots of love.
Yeah, so another fascinating conversation now. I mean, really fortunate to get that insight on number 10 from Fiona and Alastair. And then, of course, Alastair's battled with depression.
I like the fact that Alastair has a quote wall behind him, which he obviously draws inspiration from when he's writing his articles and penning his books. And I love that quote from Marilyn Monroe. I never have heard that one before, of Think in Ink.
Yeah,
I mean,
brilliant.
you can absolutely imagine that is it's a very cathartic process, writing and writing things through and thoughts through. And I suppose with mental health and depression and issues around that, it really probably does help to sit down and think in ink. So I like that a lot. Thank you for watching and or listening. We are Ben and Georgie Ainsley, and this has been Performance People. And remember, from what we've learned today, openness and thinking in ink is the way forward. So that would be our takeaway.